Hey gang, Dre here for Motorsport 101 with another video for you, and this is something that I wanted to do for a couple of days now, and something that I thought was genuinely quite intriguing. There was a tweet that went viral about 3 or 4 days ago, and it was along the lines of, name something you could talk about for 30 minutes non-stop. And it was interesting to me because I literally said I could talk about the Sebastian Vettel era of dominance for half an hour straight, uncontested. One of my friends and a fellow Formula 1 YouTuber known as Felicia on F1 said, do it. And if you guys know me well enough on Twitter, you know that I like a challenge. So, here we go. I wanted to talk about this because I think it's something that isn't talked about an awful lot. And I'll get towards why at the end of this video, because I think the way we cover Formula 1 and motorsport has changed rapidly in the last 3 or 4 years or so. But I wanted to challenge myself. I've made many style of videos like this before. So this is going to be a little bit rambly. It's going to be a little bit podcasty, but obviously I'm flying solo here. My advice would be, have this on in the background while you're doing something else. It's not going to be massively captivating in the background, but I think you might find it reasonably enjoyable. Treat it like a podcast more than a video, but I wanted to give this a go, and I think I could. I did a lot of notes and a lot of thinking about that era, and yeah. So Felicia, this is for you. I hope you guys appreciate it. And yeah, I'm going to have my clock on in the background here. It's a pixel art speaker, but it also has a countdown timer. So you'll see the clock wind down for the next half hour. And we'll go from there. But I think it can be done. At least that's the impression that I get anyway. So, without further ado, start the clock. Now, for those guys who don't know me very well, or are newer viewers of Motorsport 101, or watching this video for the first time, I've been making motorsport videos since September 2011. I've been doing this for nearly 10 years now. And I really got into the scene hardcore, almost by accident. Formula 1 was one of the many sports I was watching back then. I was watching the NFL, I was watching football. F1 was one of those sports that I just did as a hobby. I got a HD Hopodge PVR or a capture card, and the first game I recorded was Formula 1. I didn't know what I was going to do long term, and I just kind of stuck with it, really. And it's evolved into what you now see as Motorsport 101 over the last decade or so. And I've mentioned bits and pieces of this overall narrative before on Twitter, on social media, in written pieces before about Vettel's time at the top. And now, look, full disclosure, I am a Sebastian Vettel fan. I have been since the very start. And talking about his place in F1 history is a very tricky thing to do, because it's, like I said, the sport's changed a lot in the last 10-15 years, very rapidly, and his place in history almost seems insignificant compared to Lewis Hamilton, especially given it's now the Hamilton era. I mean, you're looking at a guy that's won 6 of the last 7 championships and won 73 Grand Prix in the last 7 years. Things were different in 2010, and I wanted to make this video to highlight some of those things and talk about the Vettel era, because I think a lot of it is riddled in misconception, and I wanted to talk about it over the next half hour or so. Because you look at the Vettel era as 2010 to 2013, that was a period where he won 4 straight championships. Won 38 Grand Prix in those 4 seasons, and a lot of people say it was a boring era, it was a boring guy at the front, and that almost objectively just isn't true. Now look, a lot of this is subjective, a lot of this is down to context and nuance, but I was around during those times, and I know that a lot of people weren't. And I wanted to highlight some elements of that era, because I remember coming into 2010, the sport was kind of in a weird place. The V8 era was still relatively new, and whatnot. Jenson Button, one of the sport's real good guys in F1, the other Brit who had to go 100+ races before his first Grand Prix win, had just won a miraculous World Championship. with Brawn GP, a team that was saved from the ashes of Honda, who were quitting the sport. 2010 was an incredible season. It was a bit all over the place. We had Mercedes as a brand new factory taken over from where Brawn GP left off. Ross Brawn was still in charge. The usual pretenders were still there though. Red Bull was still good. Ferrari was still good. McLaren were in the mix. And people talk about Vettel's dominance. I've maintained from the start, maybe 1.5 seasons of the 4 were dominance. 2010 and 2012, the even-numbered years in particular, were 2 of F1's greatest seasons on record. Now, I've said it before, 2010 felt like one of the first years where the sport was starting to be covered in a different way. Social media was like Twitter had just kind of become one of the mainstream apps used for social media as an alternative to Facebook. I've said before, Vettel was really properly the first social media era world champion. And the way he won that first title was never going to unite people behind him. It was never going to galvanise people like that. There's reasons for that, which I'll get to later, some that are more significant than others. But even the way he won that world title in 2010 was going to split the room. It was kind of obvious it was always going to split the room. I'll tell you why. First and foremost, his teammate was Mark Webber. Mark Webber was a universally liked and respected grinder. Like, he had often had great qualifying performances and punchy undercard performances for teams like Jaguar, teams like Williams. He joined Red Bull, and Red Bull was still almost more of a comedic, like, not taking this too seriously, flashy midfield team, as opposed to the championship-winning juggernaut that it would become. Webber had finally seemingly gotten that reward for his loyalty to midfield teams. He'd finally gotten a car that was capable of winning Grand Prix. This is going back to 2009. You know, when he won his first Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. Like, it was like, yeah, Webber, one of the likeable Australian underdogs. And look, I'm a British guy. Like, we pretend to hate the Australians, but we don't really hate the Australians. It's more of a panto rivalry at this point. We liked. He was a grinder, he worked hard, and he got his due. 2010 was when things changed. 2010, was the second year they were teammates of Sebastian, and there was a flashpoint. Obviously, Turkey was one of them. Vettel and Webber hit each other. Looking back on the footage now, it was pretty clear that it was Vettel was the majority in the wrong, took himself and Webber out of a race. Webber was seen, I think, in the eyes of the public as being a more sympathetic figure, but the team, and I think particularly Dr. Helmut Marko, backed Vettel in that incident instead. So I think a lot of fans directed a lot of their frustration towards, shall we say, Sebastian, as opposed to Webber. Also, I'm a bit annoyed my clock in the background there isn't showing the time anymore, but nah, we'll roll with it. I've got my clock on the bottom of OBS as well, so that'll be fine. You'll just hear the alarm go off after half an hour instead. But no, as I was saying, I think Webber was seen as the sympathetic one in that scenario, and Vettel got a lot of the shit. Now, that's inevitable. People get judgmental over incidents like that on Twitter and all over the place. That's a part of the sport. It always has been. So Webber was automatically a bit more popular. There was also Britain, the race where Vettel and Webber both had an upgraded front wing. Vettel's failed during qualifying. There was only one upgraded front wing left. They took it off Webber's car, put it on Vettel's. Vettel qualified on pole but had a bad start, and it was a race that Mark Webber would go on to win after, remember, he famously smashed his water bottle against the table when he qualified in second out of sheer frustration. It was a race that Webber would go on to win. It was one of the great British Grand Prix of all time, and it gave birth to the infamous quote of, "not bad for a number 2 driver." And again, another reason we liked Webber so much. He was honest. We respected honesty. We liked seeing, the raw emotion of Webber in front of our own eyes. There was no hiding his frustration at the situation and his backhanded compliment back to the team when he won the Grand Prix and rubbed their noses in it. There's a great sense of schadenfreude around that with Mark Webber. So we rooted for him. It made sense. I get it. I could understand if people wanted Webber to win that title in 2010. Even the way it ended felt like a bit of a smash and grab. I mean, 2 races to go in Korea, and there was 5 dudes who could still have won the title. Webber, Alonso, Hamilton, Vettel, and I think Felipe Massa had still an outside chance of winning the championship going into that second to last race. Webber binned it from a decent position under his own volition. Vettel's engine blew up, and going into the final race, we still had 4 men who could win the title. 4. And of course, everybody got mad about it because Abu Dhabi was a terrible Grand Prix that year. The track was terrible, you couldn't pass anybody around it. And Webber and Alonso didn't qualify particularly well. They were stuck in the midfield fighting for minor points and couldn't pass the rolling roadblock of Vitaly Petrov behind him, even under pit stops and whatnot. Vettel qualified on pole, controlled the race, won it pretty much unchallenged from Lewis Hamilton, and then Vettel, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a guy that didn't lead the championship at any point in 2010, became the youngest ever world champion at 23. A guy that we didn't even really know all that well, outside of that one miracle win he had for Toro Rosso at Monza in 08. That was a nice feel-good story, but we hadn't really gotten used to Vettel being a top contender yet. It was only really the second year of him driving a car that was worth a damn. Certainly an elite-level car. I mean, don't get me wrong, there will always be an appeal in the midfield in Formula 1. We always seem to prop up the midfield, especially when it comes to things like Driver of the Day votes or, Driver of the Year candidates. We always like to push up the midfield nominees like a Pierre Gasly or a Sergio Perez, or in the past like a Carlos Sainz, for example. But it almost felt like a smash and grab, a term that's often used in football when a defending team will park people in front of their goal for 90 minutes to hold out and then maybe go down the end at the end of the game, score a shock winner, and then get out of town. It feels undeserved. You feel dirty for the fact that that team has won, and then, you just go about your business. It felt like a smash and grab to a lot of people. I remember it. It didn't feel like Vettel deserved the championship. Which I think was what made the following season in 2011 so shocking. We don't talk about 2011 so much in the context of great Formula 1 seasons because Vettel was unbelievably good in 2011 and no one speaks about it anymore. It's one of those seasons that's almost like lost in history. We don't talk about 2011 because there was not an awful lot of memorable things to take away from that season, but I think a lot of people have forgotten just how good Vettel was in 2011. If Lewis Hamilton had had a season like this, we'd be putting him on a plinth. It was a lot like Marc Marquez in MotoGP in 2019, when he basically went the entire season finishing either first or second. Marquez that year had, I think, 12 wins. I think he had 7 second places and 1 DNF, something along those lines. It was something utterly ridiculous. He was completely untouchable for an entire year. You run the numbers on Vettel's 2011. 11 wins. 15 pole positions that season. 15. He had 16 races out of 19 that season where he finished first or second. Was on the podium 17 times out of 19. In fact, the only 2 races he didn't get on the podium... Pardon me, I got a cough for some reason now. That came out of nowhere. Bit of a dry throat, really. The only 2 races he didn't get on the podium on, really, was 1 4th place in Germany, and then puncture damage from a DNF in the final round in Abu Dhabi, where his tyre pretty much fell off the rim. In Abu Dhabi, like at the second corner. He broke the all-time record for points in a season. I know the 25 system is a much shorter and grandfathered-in rule compared to most of F1, where it was the old 10-6 system or the 10-8-6 system we had until 2010. But 392 points was a record that has barely been touched since. You've had a couple of Hamilton seasons now where he's had 400 plus, but that's also because the season and the calendar's gotten bigger in recent years. That was only a 19 race season in 2011. Now we've got 21 or 22 races now. We've got 23 this year, COVID barring, depending on what happens. But ultimately, to have that many points in a 19 race season was unheard of. It was probably the only season where Red Bull had the most undisputed best car pretty much from start to finish. Like, the other seasons, it was a lot more open-ended and a lot more competitive. 2011, right out of the gate, pretty much out of the traps, Vettel had the best car in the field. Without question. That was like the one season where you couldn't really argue that point. But even though Webber wasn't exactly following him home every single race like we've seen in the Mercedes era, you know, and you can take that either way as to whether how good Vettel is or how good his car was. Even then, a lot more talk wasn't about how good Vettel was driving. A lot of the narrative came towards Adrian Newey, the guy who was designing his car. Now, don't get me wrong, Adrian Newey is a Hall of Famer. If we opened up Formula One's Hall of Fame beyond its world champions and talked about other significant figures in its history also getting inducted, like a Bernie Ecclestone, or a Colin Chapman, or a Jean Todt, or a Ross Brawn, etc., etc., Adrian Newey would absolutely be in there. He's designed, I think, 10 championship-winning cars in his career as a designer and technical magnate of Formula One. A lot more of the talk was around the aerodynamics of the Red Bull car, and that the Red Bull car itself was busted, and it wasn't so much about how well Vettel was driving it. It's a bit unfortunate in that sense, because, and I'll talk about this more when we get to 2012, it seems that the narrative had changed. It was less about how good Vettel was, it was more about the car, the designers behind the car, and that the pound-for-pound argument was still going towards other drivers who looked better in bad machinery. That's kind of been a narrative that Formula One has always had. But it's like people were coming up with mitigating reasons not to talk about how good he was. A guy that had one of the all-time great seasons in Formula One history. A guy that had completely spanked the field from top to bottom. Like, on pure numbers alone, I don't think even Hamilton's had a season as good as Vettel's 2011. 11 wins, 15 poles, 17 podiums, 392 points. Good lord! It was an incredible season. But people remember it more for how good the Red Bull RB7 was, and less about the guy behind the wheel, which is weird because, as I talk about later on, that narrative has changed regarding how we talk and discuss drivers in this climate. Then you got 2012. And I've spoken about this many a time. 2012 is probably the greatest season in F1 history. Certainly in the most modern of era, like the last 20-25 years. 2012 is an incredible F1 season. 2012, you had 7 different winners in the first 7 races of the year. 6 of the 12 teams won a Grand Prix that season. So half the paddock celebrated at least one win. Pastor Maldonado won a race. Kimi Räikkönen for Lotus won a race. You know, Nico Rosberg won his first Grand Prix in China that year. A very underrated race that people don't talk about at all. Vettel won a race. Webber won a race. Alonso won multiple races. Hamilton won races. Button won a race. We had 13 different dudes on the podium. Like, Sergio Perez had multiple podiums. He became a superstar almost overnight because of the fact he nearly won in Malaysia. He probably should have won the Malaysian Grand Prix that year. There's an argument he probably should have won at Monza if the race was a little bit longer. Like, Kamui Kobayashi had a podium that season. You know, Michael Schumacher had the magic of that one last pole position lap at Monaco that year. There's a brilliant montage that Eddie Jordan did for BBC F1 that year. It's still on YouTube now. It's only a couple of minutes long. I'm sure I'll probably put it in the background here somewhere, talking about how great that season was. It's beautifully done. If you've never seen it, go out of your way to see it, because it's a lovely short watch. But it really was true. The 2012 season was magical. At the front of it, you had a brilliant fight between Alonso and Vettel for the championship, and not just any championship. It was both of them fighting for their third championships. We, for some reason, have always become addicted to things in threes, and even winning a third title would probably be the sign that, yeah, you're probably really, really good as an F1 driver. The only exception is probably Nelson Piquet, and we don't talk about Nelson in the same way we talk about other triple world champions, or even less than that, in cases like Hakkinen or Alonso. They were both gunning for their third title. And a lot of people forget, Alonso had a 45-point lead in the middle of that season. Alonso was looking really good to win that third title until Vettel turned up the wick in the second half of the year. Don't get me wrong, there was, again, more mitigation, more nuance. Alonso was taken out in Belgium, that incredible crash that Romain Grosjean was blamed for, and he got a race ban for it. There was also Japan, where he and Raikkonen collided at the first corner, and Vettel won all 4 races in Asia to take the championship lead. But the narrative was wonderful, because by the time we got to the end, Vettel's luck ran out. He had to start the Abu Dhabi race from the back of the field because his team didn't put enough fuel in the car. An exact same ailment as to what happened to Hamilton in Spain that year. But then Vettel came through the field multiple times to finish in third. It was an incredible fight back. And then you've got Brazil, where he was spun out by Bruno Senna on the first lap, had a damaged car in the rain, and drove beautifully to come back from 20th to finish just ahead of Michael and just well enough in the points to win the title by 3. It was an incredible fight. And look, Hamilton was in the mix, and that was kind of the problem. We still weren't giving Vettel his due. We still thought at that point in time that the pound-for-pound kings in Formula 1 were Alonso and Hamilton. I remember I had an Ask FM page around this time. People were sending me anonymous questions. The top 3 drivers in F1 are Alonso, Hamilton, and Vettel. But Vettel was rarely number 1. It was Alonso who was seen as the pound-for-pound king for his competitiveness and winning in a car that wasn't deemed to be the best. If Alonso had won a title in 2010 or 2012, he wouldn't be getting the underdog card that he did. And that's the thing with Alonso that will ultimately make his career so frustrating, was that, yeah, he won 2 world titles, but he was 4 points short in 2010. He was 3 points short in 2012. He was 1 point short in 2007. I could understand the argument back then that Alonso was probably the best driver in the world. But, again, it was seen that, Red Bull's the best car. Vettel's just winning because he's got the best car. Hamilton was beloved by a lot more fans because he was fast as hell. And he drove for McLaren, who was a lot more popular. Back then, they dipped for a bit, and now in their papaya form, they've become the team of the simp. But he had 2 big comebacks to win that title, Vettel in 2012 at the end of the year. But it seemed that people just, I think, liked Alonso and Hamilton more. And if people didn't want to put their name on it, I got buried for being a Vettel fan back then. Everybody thought Alonso was Hamilton is better. I remember getting into many an argument with dudes like Game Riot, who's now one of the biggest Let's Players on YouTube, because he grew up a Hamilton fan, I grew up a Vettel fan, and we butted heads over it. A lot. I remember those days. There was this overall arc that Vettel was, just a little bit inferior because his car was so good. Never got around that. Look, it's always been the way. And look, it didn't help when guys like Alonso were spinning this up. Alonso took to the Met press and always complained. He was bitter regarding Sebastian's success. He always was. He said, well, let's see what Vettel does when he's not in the number 1 car. Even though most people know in Formula 1, the best car wins. It's an engineering sport first, and a driving sport probably second. I think the influence of the car is better than the influence of the driver 9 times out of 10, especially when seasons are uncompetitive. But Alonso hated that. He hated the fact that he wasn't winning, and he hated the fact that a guy that he thought was worse than him and had a better car than him was doing better than him on the results sheet. And people took that ball and ran with it. And then it got worse, because 2013 then happened, and there was again mitigation that made dominance seem, better or worse. There was big debates of Pirelli regarding the tyres. Mercedes had an illegal test. They changed the composition of the Pirelli tyres a couple of times that season for safety reasons and for performance reasons. There was big politics at play. But 2013 had Multi-21. The most overblown early reaction to an F1 incident years ahead of its time than I've ever seen in Formula 1. Formula 1 fans can never agree on anything, but if there's one thing that most F1 fans would agree on, it's that team orders are a necessary evil and no one likes them. In a sporting sense, we've never liked team orders. We've always hated it. We saw what happened with Ferrari, with Schumacher and Barrichello, and giving up steps on the podium and letting Schumacher pass for the championship. We hated team orders. So the one time a driver ignores team orders, drives hard, goes for the win, and has a brilliant fight with Mark Webber to try and win that Grand Prix as it is, one of the best fights of the 2013 season. When the guy ignores the team order and wins, we hated him for it. We made Vettel the villain. I think people were looking for an easy excuse to paint Vettel as that villain. Mostly because of, finger points. That was about as far as it went. So that's why people didn't like Seb very much. And I'll get into some of the deeper reasons why later on. But the finger point is arrogant. As if we've never seen athletes throw chalk up in the air as an elite form of celebration. This was apparently a sign of arrogance, but doing this was seen as cool. It was always kind of weird with Seb. It was like people were looking for a really big reason to dislike him and couldn't find one. And then Multi-21 happened and it was like, Webber's the victim again. We got him. It's like, we can now make Vettel the villain because people didn't like the fact he won as it is. And then they find out, oh my god, he's broken a team order. F1 Racing Magazine had a full spread of Vettel in a Darth Vader mask. They called him Darth Vettel. They wanted an easy hate figure so bad, and they decided, we're going to make Vettel the villain because he points his finger and wins too much. It was a weird thing. I can understand Vettel apologising to his team. Ultimately, he's broken a team order, and that's never going to go down well internally. He should never have apologised to the fans. What do I care if he broke a team order? It's not my business. He's not taking money off my table, And he didn't even really mean it, because a week later when they raced in China, he was like, I was faster, I passed him, I won. So you could tell if he did apologise, it wasn't a particularly sincere one. Or either that or he moved on pretty quickly on the whole thing. But because, again, we liked Mark Webber as a sympathetic underdog in the team setup where Vettel had clearly gotten priority as a clear number one in a 1-2 punch, we took sympathy on Mark. And that dragged out for half a season. It wasn't until Singapore until it really stopped, and I'll tell you why in a second. I remember being on YouTube in that time, and I remember channels like Pole Position P1 that were making a video about saying, is Seb killing the sport? Is Seb driving fans away because he's winning? No one the only person that was shit scared about drivers driving fans away was Bernie Ecclestone in 2004 when Schumacher had won his 5th straight title. Ferrari had gone 6 on the bounce, and it was like, whoa, what's going to happen? If Schumacher keeps winning, people won't watch anymore. So he changed the rules. Brought in the tyres have to run the whole race rule because he knew it crippled the Bridgestone. Because Ferrari was built for short, sharp stints, not going long over an entire race and saving tyre wear and being able to run an entire Grand Prix. And it worked for a year. It stopped Schumacher from winning, and it made Alonso world champion in a fight against Kimi Raikkonen. Two guys that were very, very fast again in short fuel stints. We were getting more of that again. I remember Hamilton talked about it. Hamilton complained that Vettel was going to be boring if he keeps winning too much, even though those complaints have mysteriously gone quiet now that Hamilton's won 73 Grand Prix in 7 years. Had twice the length of dominance that Sebastian's ever had, and probably to an even stronger degree than any other of these champions we've had in recent times. You know, the real reason fans weren't watching wasn't because Vettel was winning, it was because free-to-air TV was dying for sports coverage. France and China had gone to pay-per-view channels. 50 million people stopped watching the sport almost overnight because they went from free-to-air to pay-per-view. And pay-per-view's great. It puts money back into the sport, like it's done with places like cricket. You know, there's money to go back into the sport to improve. You often get better coverage, but there's also the acceptance that less people are ultimately going to watch it. And that's the nature of pay-per-view. That's what pay-per-view's always been. You know? But of course, it was very easy to point the finger at the world champion we didn't like very much, who had an arrogant celebration, made Webber look worse, and was winning in a car that people thought was so overpowered that the driver was mediocre. They needed an out. They needed an excuse, and Vettel became the very convenient excuse. And after Multi-21, he was booed on every podium he faced in. I remember the British Grand Prix where his car died towards the end of that race. Had to park it on the front straight. He was sarcastically applauded as his car died on the front straight and had to walk back to the garage. Oh my god, Vettel's not winning! Yeah! Woo! It was seen as a big deal. And it sucked. Cheering for a guy that DNF'd is a bit shit. Like, the man got booed just for doing his job properly for months. It was only Singapore when it stopped because Martin Brundle, during the podium interviews, turned around to the booing fans. Half an hour already, and I'm not even done yet. Let's keep going. Like, I distinctively remember Brundle turning around and telling the fans, like, no, that's not right. And I remember that was a Grand Prix that Vettel had driven really hard for 2 hours. Because Singapore was the longest Grand Prix on the calendar for time. It's hit the 2-hour limit on multiple occasions. You lose 3 kilos because it's so hot and sweaty and humid in the cars. It's an incredibly physically demanding Grand Prix. He slaughtered the field. He won that Grand Prix by over half a minute. And there was a safety car halfway through. He was completely untouchable that day. That entire weekend. Couldn't get near him. He was brilliant. It was magnificent. It was a drive that everybody stood up and applauded, apart from the fans. And then Brundle had to turn around and was like, this is getting ridiculous. Stop booing him. Basically, there was no real good reason to boo Seb on those podiums, but it happened anyway. I remember that same weekend they were talking to the media, and other guys like Nico Rosberg and Jenson Button and Ross Brawn were saying that the booing was stupid and needed to stop. It made everybody look stupid. And that's what happened. Not to mention the small minor thing of Vettel winning 9 races in a row to end the season, which has not been done since. I'm not sure it will ever happen again, where a guy wins 9 Grand Prix in a row in the middle of the season. I don't think we ever truly acknowledged just how crazy winning 9 straight in a season is. It's not been matched since. Do you know how many variables have to go your way to win 9 Grand Prix in a row? Of course it's luck to a degree. Luck's a factor in all sports. But in F1, a sport with 1,000 variables where cars can die, equipment can fail, teams can get strategy decisions wrong, you can get taken out of a Grand Prix 10 seconds in, you can be tagged, you can be taken out, you can have a puncher, something freaky can happen at every corner. For a guy to win 9 Grand Prix in a row with that level of consistency and strength was remarkable. It was an incredible run of form. It had not been seen like that for years, and it's unlikely we will ever see something like that again. But again, best car. When he won that championship in India that weekend, within minutes of Vettel's iconic celebration of bowing down to his RB9, throwing his gloves into the Indian fans, and India loved him. He'd won every Grand Prix they ever raced in India. I remember Martin Brundle on the world feed commentary cut to Christian Horner and Adrian Newey jumping up and down celebrating together. And I remember Martin Brundle literally made the comment, "That's the most important man in the sport and not the guy with the blonde hair," referring to Vettel, who bleached blonde his hair earlier that season. He claimed that Adrian Newey was more important to Red Bull's success than the man behind the wheel. That would not fly in 2020 if that was said about Lewis Hamilton. There would be a nuclear firestorm on Twitter if David Croft had turned around and said that James Allison was a more important factor for Mercedes' success than Lewis Hamilton. It would be DEFCON 4 on Twitter if that had happened. But because we'd gotten into this state of being that Vettel was not the reason that team was so good, it was deemed as a socially acceptable comment. Sebastian Vettel was public enemy number 1 to F1 in 2013, and it was not even close. Not even close. It's one of the greatest 4-year spans in F1 history. It's a title run that would rival Schumacher's from 2000 to 04. It was an incredible run of winning. And hey, guess what happened in 2014? Daniel Ricciardo came in, the cars changed, Red Bull had a car that didn't suit Vettel's driving style. Ricciardo had a brilliant 2014, his first season in a big boy seat, beat Sebastian, became team leader. Sebastian walked away a year later, and that was the mitigating factor that people who didn't like Sebastian Vettel needed. It was another get out of jail free card. It was like, see, told you it was all the car. The moment Ricciardo comes in, he beats him. And I'm just sitting there just going, oh crap, here we go again. He was almost deemed to be somewhat of a coward for leaving that team the moment they stopped winning, to go to Ferrari, even though Ferrari was the team of his childhood dreams, because Schumacher was one of his heroes. Ricciardo was fantastic that season. I'm not ever going to take that away from him. It was an incredible season where he earned almost elite driver status straight away. He was fantastic. And again, Ricciardo is another great figure for the sport. Happy-go-lucky, smiling, charming, great racer, entertaining to watch, genuinely charismatic outside of the car, charming, likeable, ticks every box. Great guy. But of course, in the sport and in the narrative and the big macho nature that elite sport often is, Vettel was seen to be the coward, walking away from a team the moment it was deemed to be a success. Even though he went to Ferrari and kicked arse a year later, was the only person that even really gave Mercedes something to think about in 2015 for a reborn and a redemptive Ferrari setup that struggled the year before with Alonso at the helm. His final year really driving a top contender, or an elite level car, or even something close to an elite level car. And people always think like this. I remember when a very prominent Formula 1 presenter who's now commentating on races said after Rosberg won the title in 2016 he was literally deemed to be a quote-unquote a pussy because he retired rather than try to retain his title against prime Lewis Hamilton. You probably know who that person is. Let's just say they like acronyms. Point is that it's hard. It's hard for me as a Vettel fan because look, I'm emotionally tied to this man, and he's one of my favourite drivers of all time. He's one of my favourite athletes of all time. And things are different now, in a good way. Maybe the winning has stopped to a degree, but I'd argue Vettel is now one of the most universally well-liked drivers of this era. No one's really got shit to say about Vettel the person. He's been rather unproblematic for the vast majority of his career. He's just an all-round likeable dude. He stood side by side with Lewis Hamilton. He was the one that came up with the idea of kneeling before races last year. as part of the GPDA alongside Grosjean. Kneeling was his idea. He didn't even hesitate before standing alongside Lewis Hamilton when he started kneeling with Black Lives Matter t-shirts. He put Black Lives Matter on his helmet. He had the beautiful diversity helmet in general that he auctioned off and raised hundreds of thousands of euros towards children in Africa, you know. And he's become an all-round likeable guy now because he stopped winning. And the moment he stopped winning regularly, we gave him the same underdog treatment we gave to other people when he was the man on top. It's amazing how things changed. And people want to talk to me about the Vettel era compared to the Hamilton era. One of the differences I've noticed is that I've noticed with Hamilton, right? Because I remember when Lando Norris talked about Hamilton after he won his 92nd Grand Prix, becoming the all-time wins leader in Portimao, and how Lando Norris was carpet bombed for not respecting Hamilton's win count as much as other people did. He was even accused of being racist by Kelechi Okafor, and I was just like, no, he's not, and he's got every right not to, you know, be the one to, you know, say, this is awesome, I want, you know, well done, Lewis. It was like, yeah, I want to beat his record one day, so no, I'm not going to sit there and respect it all the time. Like, Hamilton gets almost every benefit of the doubt when it comes to his success. Like, I remember getting into big arguments on Twitter towards the end of last year because I said the car was a significant factor towards Hamilton's success, and people didn't want to hear it. Maybe the timing was a bit too raw. Maybe it was a bit too close to this historic weekend that Hamilton had broken all these records. Maybe my timing was off. But we don't talk about the W11 as an all-time great car. We talk about Hamilton and every little facet of Hamilton's game becoming the leading mark towards his success. Vettel didn't get any of those benefits of the doubt. Never. Never, ever, ever. In Vettel's case, it was 100% the car. He was never seen to be on the same level as Alonso and Hamilton and other guys in his era when he was winning. The benefit of that went against him. It was the car. It was Adrian Newey. It was the diffusers. You know, it was, you know, the aerodynamics of the car. And look, it's a delicate juggling act. It's a tug of war between driver performance, especially given we as fans care more emotionally about the drivers than ever before, especially in the last 2 years of the rise of shows like Drive to Survive. You know, the sport has become somewhat blended with the world of reality television, which never tells the story of what actually happens. It tells the story of what the producers want to tell you. It's their narrative, not ours. It's become very footballized. It's like territorial. You know, you could be a hardcore Lando fan or a hardcore, George Russell fan or a hardcore Alex Albon fan. We are now magnetically glued and emotionally tied to the drivers more than ever before. That's sexy. Talking about the engineering or the car side, that's not sexy at all. We're now more emotionally tied to the drivers. It's become a much more personality-driven sport in the rise of social media, the rise of Liberty Media actually manifesting the sport's social media. We as fans have become more emotionally tied into the sport than ever before. Certainly more than what it was in my era. When I was growing up, when I was a video maker back in my time. Certainly. And when you combine that with Lewis Hamilton, a guy that has genuinely done a lot of good off the track, you know, he's championed diversity, championed social injustice, and has become a lot more likeable off the track. And especially he's become a guy that has embraced the celebrity nature and has more relevant hobbies to a mainstream world like music and fashion and pop culture, and trying to tap into the American market, and has become the social media celebrity F1 driver we've always kind of wanted in F1. Trust me, when Hamilton didn't win Sports Personality, we as fans would go apeshit because we always got insecure that Hamilton was not as popular on the global stage as a Roger Federer or a Usain Bolt or a Rafa Nadal or a Cristiano Ronaldo or Lionel Messi. We always got mad insecure about that. Until now. Hamilton's now on that level in 2020 and 2021. He's a massive name. He's the face of a sport. Something that Vettel was never going to be. Because Vettel was not a social media guy. He lives a quiet, private life on a farm with his wife and children. His hobbies are fixing motorcycles and farming and agriculture and trying to make the world a bit more of an environmentally friendly place. That shit ain't sexy. Hamilton's what we want the sport to be. Vettel is just who he is. And the way that, you know, the new fans have come into the sport, the way the sport's covered and the way it's changed, has changed that dynamic a lot. And it's a shame. I'm not taking anything away from Hamilton's success. It's fantastic what Hamilton has done on and off the track. He's going to retire as the greatest F1 driver the sport's ever seen, and probably will ever see. He's going to have 100 plus wins, 100 plus pole positions, probably at least 8 titles, maybe more if he wants it. He will be the pantheon of greatness that this sport would rarely think we'd see a driver with more to his name than Schumacher. And we will with Hamilton. I have no doubt in my mind about that. No doubt in my mind about that. I just think it's a bit of a shame that we kind of glossed over an incredibly brilliant era of driving with Sebastian Vettel. And don't get me wrong, booing for dominance is not a new thing. That's absolutely a factor as well. I think a factor is the fact that a lot of fans of this sport are British. I don't think we like the Germans very much. I remember seeing lots of xenophobic abuse towards him and Nico Rosberg on social media when they were doing their winning. There's a lot of little factors that come into play. Cultural differences, where they come from, where the fans are coming from. There's a lot to discuss. There's a lot to unearth. There's a lot to unpack. It's not straightforward. But I've always felt that, you know, the Vettel era is something that is not looked upon fondly. Especially given I'd argue that the racing was just as good then, if not better than it is now. But hey, good for Hamilton. And good for Seb. I think we often forget about how good some of these guys until they retire, until their pages of history stop turning. Hopefully time will change. I think it already has to a degree. I think there is a lot more subtle appreciation for Vettel's contribution towards F1 as the twilight of his career enters with a new era at Aston Martin, and the fact he's in his mid-30s now. You know, he hasn't got an awful amount of years left in the sport. Maybe. So, hey, maybe it's a little bit of that as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments as always. I thought this was going to be a 30-minute video. I've ended up going 45, nearly. That is me. I am so extra. I thought it would be half an hour. It's now like a 45-minute vid. I never do anything by half measures, me. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts on the Vettel era were. Vettel as a driver, the comparisons between then and now, if you've been watching for a long time, or if you followed the sport on social media. I would love your opinions on this. I think it's fascinating to talk about. But yeah. I've been Dre Harrison. Thank you very much for watching or for listening. I've gone on for nearly 50 minutes. You know, if you've liked it, please leave a like, subscribe, all of that good stuff. I really do appreciate it if you stuck it out this long. Thank you. I'll talk to you guys soon. And yeah, sayonara.